Hi there, Dave here with the second video about our parking structure application. And in this video we're going to cover how the application works, not what it does. So when we take a look at it, we see a very simple main. We've got floors defined. Notice that floors it's not defined as a two-dimensional array. If it was, then I would be defining it with another bracket next to it. Although it is a two-dimensional array when I get done with it. But I'm building floors as an array, and then I'm going to stick an array inside of each one of the elements of this array. So I've got to get everything ready first. So I go ahead and I initialize the array. And I pass in the number of rows and the number of parking spaces per row. The number of floors and the parking spaces per floor. That probably should be maybe a constant. But if I don't make it a constant, and I just pass it in right here, then that means nobody else can use the constant, which means that everybody's going to have to depend upon what was actually built to determine when they fall off the end of the floor. In other words, how many spaces can I look through? How many floors do I have? I want the user of the application to go out and see how many floors there are and how many spaces there are, not depend upon a global variable. So let's take a look at how init garage looks. I suppose what we do is we pass in the array that's going to be initialized, right, and the number of floors. And so f is going to be the number of floors, and so we say while f, which starts at 0, and we're going to go up to the number of floors. And what I do for each one of those, I go ahead and I make another array called parking spaces. And then I initialize parking spaces. So I make a new array called parking spaces, and then I set I, which is the parking space number, and I go through this loop as long as I have parking spaces. So as long as I is less than the number of spaces, which was passed into us, right? Then what I do is I append a blank string so that I'm putting a blank string into each one of the array pieces in parking spaces, and then I append the parking spaces to the floor. So after I build the parking spaces array and populate it with null length strings, then I append that parking space to the floors, just as I appended the blanks to the parking spaces. And that's how we do it when we're building the array dynamically. We're building each element and sticking it in. That's the way to go. So that's how we build a multi-dimensional array dynamically. So after we've got this floors, and remember floors is a list, it's an array, right? So that means that it's mutable. And so after it's all done, we come back up to our main, and we have our standard loop here for our menu. We display the elements in the menu, which you see, and then we say, what do you want to do? And if it's not X, then we do one of these things. So if it's a 1, we do display. If it's 2, we display the open spaces, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and look at how we do each one of these things. There's display cars, and the next one is display open spaces. And in fact, you can see that these are similar, and yet actually they are a little bit different. Let's go take a look at them. Here we are going to display all the cars. So we start with F being 0, and we're going to go through all of the floors. That's what that says, right? While F is less than the length of the floors. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the contents of the first element in the floor and make spaces out of it. So now we have an array called spaces. We put it in as an array, it comes back out again. We could call it whatever we want, but it was an array when we put it into the first element. It comes back out as an array in the first element. Now we can go through all of those spaces. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, well, if there's nothing in the space, then say none. Otherwise, go ahead and display the contents of the space. Now, notice that down here, I am displaying the contents of floor sub F sub I. Here, I could have referenced just the spaces that I was at. I could have referenced spaces sub I, but instead, I am showing you here how to reference the element within the two-dimensional array, although I could have been referencing the one-dimensional array spaces that I pulled out of floors, the element in floors. So there we go. So down in display open spaces, notice that I did the same thing in the if statement here that I did down here. Instead of pulling out a space, the spaces array here, instead of doing that, I just decided not to use spaces at all. I'm just going to reference, instead of the spaces and doing the spaces thing, I'm just going to go ahead and reference the floors sub F sub I. And if you stare back and forth between these two implementations, you'll see what I'm talking about. This implementation uses a secondary array which is named. This also uses a secondary which is not named. There is no name. There is no spaces array. And here we're referencing the element in the floors array as a two-dimensional array. And hopefully, looking at the difference between these two will help you understand what a two-dimensional array is all about. All right, let's go take a look at AdCar. What we do in AdCar is we go ahead and take the input in, split it into its component pieces. So we have the name and the floor number and the space number. And then we say, hey, if there's nobody in that space, go ahead and add that space and add the name to that space. And then go ahead and print that everything was successful. Otherwise, go ahead and say somebody's already in there and this is who it is. Now, when it comes to remove, all we're passing in there is we're passing in the name. And so what we're going to do is we're setting up a couple loops. So we're going to look through all of the elements. We're going to look through all the spaces on all the floors looking for the name that matches the name that was passed in. And if we find it, then what we're going to do is we're going to set that position back equal to its default, which was the space, the nothing, the null length string, and then say, hey, we did it okay. However, if we got all the way through everything, and we went through all the spaces on all the floors, then where we're going to come to is this. This is where we're going to be if we went through all of them and we didn't find it. We get down to here. So we say name is not part of it, right? So if we got all the way to the bottom through both loops, then we didn't find it. So we print we didn't find it. And there's the application. The last thing down at the bottom is the execution of main. Notice that I put little comments, at least comments above each one of the procedures saying what it did. And then up at the top, some kind of documentation about what the whole thing is about. And there we go. Enjoy.